Hello, everyone. My name is Mark Blythe, and I am the director of the Rhodes Centre for International Economics and Finance at Brown University. It is my distinct pleasure to have here today two of my colleagues, Professor Savia Barta and Professor Alison Johnson. What we're going to talk about today, and I wanted to kick off the current semester's offerings with this talk in particular, is something that we were really excited about 10 years ago, but we've kind of forgotten, which are credit rating agencies. So you remember the story from 10 years ago, right? The people who were issuing mortgage bonds, we were shocked to discover, paid for the rating. And then they were accused of misrating these things, and it was a competition between them to get the most money, and there were accusations of moral hazard. And then we found out from their congressional testimony that they didn't actually offer ratings, they offered opinions, and these were protected by the First Amendment, and all sorts of things like that. They kind of died out. We stopped caring about them as much. But Barta and Johnson didn't, and they started to look into something else. So what's the something else? It's about sovereign credit ratings, rating countries, which is very important, in particular in the European sovereign debt crisis. And they have a different type of argument. They say it's the business model, but it's not the moral hazard story. It's a very different story, and it's a really interesting, and I think very compelling one. So rather than inflating ratings to get business, when it comes to sovereign debt, the trick is to insure the rating agency against unexpected losses. Now, given that you can't know what the future will hold, but you know the future will hold shocks, how do you do that? Well, you do that by estimating a state's capacity for what they call fiscal flexibility. That is, can they raise taxes and cut spending quickly to stabilize the rating? Now, why would they care about this? Well, because big rating downgrades are bad for business. Because rating downgrades of the state determines downgrades in all the other bonds that are issued by that state. And also because of certain rules out there in finance, this leads to what you would call big portfolio reallocations that have second order shocks. So basically, they're not really interested in the truth of the rating, so much as they're interested in the stability of the rating for the basic business model of the firm. Two consequences, which I hope we get to explore in conversation, follow from this. First of all, it means really that ratings are driven by the bottom line more than neoliberal ideas, which is a very interesting and compelling finding. But what it also means is policies that actually hurt lots of people, like austerity, emerge at the level of the firm seeking to avoid losses, rather than in bond market vigilantes pushing cuts because of particular ideas. It's a fascinating account. Welcome to you both.
Thank you so much, Mark, for the kind introduction and for the invitation to present our work. Let me quickly share my screen. I hope it's visible. So Alison and I are going to present our new book today called Rating Politics: How Sovereign Credit Ratings Reward and Penalize Political and Policy Choice in Prosperous Developed Countries. And I'm sure I don't have to introduce sovereign credit ratings to anybody in this audience, because sovereign credit ratings have been on everyone's radar at least since the last financial crisis. We all remember the storm that they triggered over Greece, the turmoil that they unleashed in Ireland, and the menace that they had over Italy and several other countries. And then I haven't even mentioned the role of sovereign ratings in the East Asian crisis in the 1990s. But what we want to talk about today is a much lesser known, more insidious effect of ratings, and that's one that plays out in normal times. In the book, we ask the question, do ratings systematically assign penalties and rewards to political and policy choice? And the background and the context for this question is that as gatekeepers in sovereign credit markets, sovereign credit ratings influence interest rates. As these regression results from 2010 IMF report show, credit ratings significantly influence the interest that countries have to pay on their debt. And these results show that this actually differs across time and across the rating scale, but they are always significant. So in a sanguine year like 2005, a one-notch difference in ratings might only account for a couple of dozen basis points, but in a more difficult year when investors are more skittish, a 1 notch difference in ratings might actually account for several hundred basis points of difference. And because countries are more indebted than ever, therefore the significance of this issue is bigger than ever. But the deeper concern about the impact of sovereign ratings and their impact on and their reactions to politics and policy is that if ratings assign tangible penalties and rewards to certain political and policy choices, then they interfere with democratic sovereignty. Because if they disapprove of political and policy choices of government, the country will suffer. And this is not only because the government itself has to pay higher interest on its outstanding debt, but also because the impacts of lower ratings undercut economic performance. And as this article from the Wall Street Journal illustrates, downgrades foreshadow worsening economic performance. Their ratings thereby become a self-fulfilling prophecy. If they say a policy will not work, then it won't work. We are, of course, not the first ones to highlight this concern. So several scholars of sovereign ratings have pointed this out, among them Tim Sinclair, Ravi Abdalal, or Mark himself. You will also notice that this question that we are asking also fits into into a broader debate about whether markets themselves constrain the political and policy choices of democracies. This debate is often referred to as the golden straitjacket debate. And so our book speaks to this debate by focusing on one particular set of market actors, credit rating agencies. And the reason why we think it's worth revisiting this problem is because the empirical validity of the concern that ratings might constrain governments by assigning tangible penalties and rewards to political and policy choices has not been explored empirically, because most of the models of what factors influence credit ratings have focused on whether they systematically respond to macroeconomic and fiscal factors. And indeed, studies consistently find that 70% of variation in ratings is explained by macroeconomic and fiscal factors that directly affect the debt servicing capacity of a country. But the other 30%, the remaining 30%, which these studies very often call the subjective component of ratings, has not been explored. In fact, many experts have claimed that this part of ratings is impossible to know because of the secretiveness of rating agencies, and they often refer to rating decisions as a black box. So what we seek to do in this book is to open that black box, and what we find is that ratings are much more easily decipherable than commonly assumed if you actually approach them as a product designed to generate profits. So what's the product itself? Well, ratings are authoritative indicators of risk. I'm happy to talk more about how these indicators are used in the question and answer session, but for now, let me just say that ratings are meant to provide reliable estimates of the probability of problems with debt servicing. But obviously, that's an impossible task because rating agencies are no better able to see the future and foresee every potential threat to debt repayment than anybody else. So as a second best solution, there are two, as a second best solution, they need to fulfill two conditions to be viable as reliable estimates of or authoritative indicators of risk. One of those preconditions is that they need to be stable enough to not force portfolio managers to constantly adjust their portfolios, which generate transaction costs. Second, and most importantly, they need to avoid nasty surprises that inflict major losses on portfolios, i.e. they need to avoid adjusting the ratings by several notches within a short time frame. This is a problem that is often called a rating failure. So with this in mind, why and how would policy and politics influence ratings? We identified two possible hypotheses. We labeled the first one the mental model hypothesis, which starts from the assumption that if ratings need to make estimates about the future debt-bearing capacity of a country, they're going to rely on some sort of mental model of the economy and how policy and indirectly politics affects the economy. And because analysts are deeply embedded in neoliberal epistemic communities, they're likely to work with mental models that assume that a big government is bad for economic performance and place penalties on large government. But as intuitive as this argument or hypothesis seem to be, there are reasons to be skeptical about it. Given what I just said about the requirements towards rating as a product, it doesn't really make sense for analysts to estimate the future of a country's debt servicing capacity based on long-term models, when ratings only need to provide estimates in the medium term. On this horizon, simple extrapolation from existing fiscal and economic trends is a much safer strategy. And so what analysts need to worry about on this horizon is not how to estimate performance under business as usual conditions. What they need to worry about is how to fortify their ratings against unpredictable shocks, which cause the dreaded rating failures, which undermine the authority of rating agencies and sour relations with the consumers of ratings. And this brings us to the second hypothesis, which, for lack of a better term, we call the insurance against failure hypothesis. And this starts from the realization that unexpected negative shocks can engender rating failure. And I want to spend a little bit of time to emphasize that it's not necessarily the direct economic and fiscal effect of shocks that cause a country to default on its debt. Because especially at the higher end of the rating scale, it's extremely unlikely that a single shock would directly cause a country to default. And therefore, as far as the direct effects of shocks are concerned, analysts could actually afford to adjust ratings gradually as the effects of the shock gradually unfold. The problem really is with the market panics, because if markets panic, there is a real chance that the given sovereign is going to be shut out of short-term funding and has to default in the short term due to liquidity problems. And this chart of Spain's credit ratings illustrate that pattern. Spain's ratings dropped 9 notches between 2009 and 2012, which is a clear example of a rating failure. But what this chart also shows is that the actual long-term effect of the shock of the global financial crisis on Spain only account for 5 notches of difference. And that even that impact played out over a fairly long period. But what we see here is that in this period of intense market uncertainty, rating agencies actually were forced to drastically downgrade Spain in order to be able to get to a level where if Spain was to default, they wouldn't be so far away from the default level. If I actually showed you Ireland's, Greece's, or Portugal's historical ratings, the pattern would be very similar. So what can rating agencies do to insure themselves against such calamity? Well, obviously, they can't predict unforeseeable shocks. So what ratings attempt to do is to gauge the likelihood that governments can stave off panic in the event of a random shock. And this is where politics and policy comes into consideration, because analysts will assign lower ratings in the presence of political and policy features that suggest weaker willingness and or ability to prioritize austerity to prop up market confidence upon a negative shock. What does this mean in concrete terms? Well, we expect that ratings are going to put a penalty on inflexible spending and tax items that make austerity harder to execute and might even aggravate the impact of economic shocks. They're also going to penalize ideological reluctance to prioritizing austerity over other economic, political, and social goals, and to institutional structures that impede decisive action. We rely on a number of different sources of evidence in evaluating these hypotheses. First of all, we read the sovereign methodologies that are publicly available on the websites of the 3 big rating agencies. We also crunch the numbers and statistically analyze the relationship between ratings and several political and policy factors. Then we analyze the reports that rating agencies publish upon each rating decision to explain why they upgrade or downgrade the country or why they affirm the ratings. And we focus on 4 countries across time in order to identify the most important factors that these justifications emphasize. We also conducted 20 in-depth, unstructured interviews with analysts and senior management. Unfortunately, we won't have time to go into this part of the evidence in the talk, but I'm very happy to field questions about it in the Q&A. And finally, I need to point out that we focus on developed prosperous developed countries in this book. And one reason for this is that this group of countries received less attention in the literature about market constraints on countries because they were long assumed to be more immune to financial market pressures. So we wanted to engage with them more in depth, but also because they were long assumed to be more immune to financial market pressures, they also constitute hard cases for us to study, meaning that if we find evidence of penalties on certain political and policy features among this group of countries, it's more than likely that we are going to find the same penalties among countries with a weaker credit standing. So starting with the methodologies, what's interesting about them is that they explicitly explain very early on that they consider market panic the major source of default, and that they look at policy patterns from a perspective of whether market panic is likely. So Standard & Poor's 2013 version of the methodology says, since the beginning of the 19th century, most sovereign defaults have occurred because a defaulting government's past policies left it ill-prepared to face an unexpected turn of events. Following a shock, when a government's previous fiscal or monetary policies leave it little room for maneuver, or when economic policy does not support sustainable economic growth, investors' perceptions tend to change quickly. This, in turn, raises financing costs and in some cases leaves the government with default as the preferred policy response. Later on, they also specify what sort of policy dimensions they look at when they try to figure out which countries are going to fall victim to such market panics. They refer to this policy dimension as fiscal flexibility, but what it really boils down is the ability and willingness of governments to restore fiscal balance in the wake of a shock. So fiscal flexibility provides governments with the room to maneuver to mitigate the effect of economic downturns or other shocks and to restore fiscal balance. And the methodology also specifies how flexibility is being evaluated. Fiscal flexibility is the ability and willingness to reduce general government expenditures in the near term, despite the economic, social, and political effect. It's the ability and willingness to raise revenues through increasing tax rates, tax coverage, or through asset sales. And it is evaluated qualitatively based on the government's track record, but also taking into account constitutional, political, or administrative difficulties. So what we find is in the sovereign methodologies already gives support to our original argumentation. I'm going to hand over to Alison now, who is going to describe the statistical results and our case studies.
Thank you. So we empirically test our insurance hypothesis via a panel analysis of rating scores for the 23 richest OECD countries from 1995 to 2016. And because this is one of the first presentations in the series, I'm not going to bore you with the details on model specification. I can do that in the Q&A. But essentially what we do is we test the impact of 17 policy variables and 4 political variables on the credit ratings issued by each of the big three. And those credit ratings are coded on a 17-point scale. So countries with a AAA credit rating receive a score of 17, and then that drops by 1 point for each notch down to CCC plus or below, which has a coding of 1. So higher ratings indicates a higher score. Now, starting with social insurance, and this figure right here presents you the point estimates for how a 1 standard deviation increase in these variables moves rating scores. And it also provides their confidence intervals. So if these confidence intervals straddle the vertical black line, that indicates a null effect. That vertical black line is at 0. And you'll notice that when we look at social insurance variables, whether it's total spending on social insurance, the level of generosity of social insurance, or subcomponents of social insurance, pension spending, pension generosity, unemployment benefit, or disability benefit, across the board, each of the big three penalize these policies with lower ratings. And you'll notice that some of these policies, in the case of unemployment insurance generosity, pension spending, higher values on these variables, countries that have higher values on these variables can see rating scores that are 1 to 2 notches lower than countries that have lower levels of social insurance spending and social insurance generosity. Now, contrast this with discretionary fiscal items which governments can change quite quickly, spending on social services, health and education, spending on public sector employees. You'll notice that for the most part, each of the big three are pretty indifferent. Their point estimates straddle 0. These do not significantly move ratings. And really, only compensation of government employees moves ratings for S&Ps and Fitch, but it actually leads to higher ratings. It does not lead to lower ratings as one would expect under a neoliberal worldview. We can talk about why public sector pay might actually be associated with higher ratings in the Q&A. Likewise with taxes, credit rating agencies are critical of some taxes, but not all of them. Tax items that bring in a lot of revenue and where high levels indicate that governments are at a threshold by which their further revenue capacity is really limited. Things like income tax, consumption tax, social security contributions in the tax wedge. These are consistently associated with lower ratings across the board from each of the big three. But corporate taxation is not. Corporate taxation burdens are either perceived as indifferently. S&Ps and Fitch are indifferent to higher corporate taxation burdens, whereas Moody's perceives them positively. And again, kind of coming back to our insurance argument, this makes sense because higher corporate tax burdens, corporate taxation is still a tax revenue source that is easier to tap, that tends to not be exhausted, but also can kind of signal that governments have high tax capacity. They're able to tax actors that are footloose and fancy-free. Now, moving on to politics, we're looking at basically the rating score for left versus right executives. And you'll notice for Standard & Poor's and Fitch, left executives do have lower rating scores on average than their right-wing liberal counterparts. Moody's is more agnostic. But really the type of executive that gets penalized are Christian Democratic executives. And Christian Democratic parties really embody kind of the problem of fiscal flexibility. They're a party that tends to champion generous social insurance, but they're also really reluctant to raise taxes, given that their constituency spans labor and capital. Checks and balances, the evidence is a bit more mixed. Moody's does view checks and balances negatively, but Standard & Poor's and Fitch's ratings are relatively unimpacted. But all three of the big three are very complementary of power sharing. Higher levels of power sharing in the central government are associated with higher rating scores. So this really provides evidence for our insurance argument. You'll notice that not all forms of taxation, not all forms of spending are associated with lower rating scores. It's really only those components that lack flexibility. And executives that are also ideologically wedded to these inflexible policy items also tend to have lower ratings. But also if parties can demonstrate a track record of working together, they will see higher ratings in their sovereign credit ratings. And before I go into our case study evidence, I should emphasize two things. One, our results are robust, even if we exclude the years of the crisis from our samples. They are not driven by the European debt crisis or the financial crisis. The overwhelming majority of those results survive, even when the years 2009 to 2016 are removed. Secondly, we also conduct a parallel analysis that examines whether bond prices and bond spreads react to these policy and political variables the same way that ratings do. And for the most part, we find that bond spreads aren't really moved by these policy or political variables once ratings are controlled for. And in some very unique cases, they actually move in the opposite direction of the way that these variables impact credit ratings. So this is kind of indicative that credit rating agencies are not following the market. They have their own unique business model. Now, we also examined discussions of politics in the ratings reports for 4 countries from 1990 to 2020 via a comprehensive text analysis. We look at the UK, Germany, Italy, and Denmark. We take countries with very diverse political and economic contexts, and we see whether this kind of insurance argument is revealed in their ratings reports. And 2 things are really important to note. First, with the exception of 2 downgrades, one in Italy and one in the UK, the justification of ratings changes and outlook issuances are largely attributed to politics in ratings reports. So politics clearly matters, even for developed countries. But second, another interesting thing that we discovered is credit rating agencies are remarkably consistent in how they talk about politics and policy and how they assess these on kind of an insurance basis across these 4 very diverse country cases. And because I don't have the time to go through all 4 of them, I'm really going to emphasize this insurance argument in both Denmark and the UK, but I can go through Italy and Germany in the discussion. So the language surrounding the discussion in the Denmark and the UK's rating reports are really contrary to what you would expect if you think that credit rating agencies follow a neoliberal worldview. So Denmark, it has a very large welfare state, it has a very high taxation burden, and they actually get a lot of criticism for this in the 2000s, even when they're generating sizable fiscal surpluses from the IMF in its Article 4 consultations. The IMF is saying that social spending is too high, they have to introduce user fees, its taxation burden is incentivizing leisure, it's incentivizing shirking at work. In contrast, credit rating agencies give Denmark very high marks. They are unconcerned with Denmark's tax burden. They are also unconcerned with its high level of expenditure on social services. And by the early 2000s, all 3 of the big 3 have upgraded Denmark to AAA. And the reason why they do so is they really applaud Denmark's long tradition of consensus making and how its political parties have coalesced around fiscal prudence and generating fiscal surpluses while also supporting a robust and generous welfare state. And Denmark's history of consensus seeking and how this enables efficient policy design and efficient policy making is constantly praised in Denmark's reports. It's constantly highlighted as something that upholds Denmark's AAA rating. Now, contrast this with the United Kingdom. You would expect the UK would get really high marks from the credit rating agencies because it has a small welfare state, it has a small tax burden, it has a reserve currency, a very powerful central bank that can provide a lot of assistance to its government in terms of financing its debt through crises. It also has a very decisive political system with limited checks and balances. And the UK does get high marks from credit rating agencies really until the mid-2010s, when political turmoil, largely driven by Brexit, introduces fragmentation and deadlock into the system, which completely harms the UK's capacity to manage its budget and fiscal balances effectively. And this causes credit rating agencies to initiate a series of downgrades starting in 2016, which they still have not corrected. And the justifications for these downgrades was due to a significant deterioration in the UK's political score and quality of governance indicators. So reaction to these events in the UK really shows that even sovereigns with reserve currency status, with very powerful central banks, even these sovereigns can fall from grace in the eyes of credit rating agencies due to domestic political developments, which limits their fiscal flexibility.
Okay, so to sum up the evidence, what we find through these various inspections of the evidence is that politics and policy matter for ratings because they attempt to gauge countries' likely reaction to shocks that are not even on the horizon. Policy is explored from the perspective of flexibility, the ability to adjust spending and taxes to rebalance the budget in the event of an unforeseen shock, whereas politics matters for assessing the willingness and decisiveness to impose fiscal pain. So our findings have a number of implications. The most direct one is that we delivered evidence that ratings assign tangible and systematic penalties to certain political and policy choices. The second one is that we also find that penalties are not ideologically motivated, which in itself has 2 further implications. On the one hand, these penalties are not going to change when the dominant paradigm changes. So recently there have been talk of changing mental frameworks in influential global institutions like the IMF and what that might mean for the future of policy making. For as far as we are concerned, or as far as ratings are concerned, what we can say is that those possible changes in the ideologies at the IMF are very unlikely to spill over into the behavior of ratings. The other implication of this minor role of ideology is that ratings have no normative content, for better or worse. So rating analysts like to say that they do not judge policy, and thereby they mean that they don't interfere in politics and policy because they're not trying to tell governments what's good for the country. But on the flip side of all this, this also implies that these penalties assigned without any concern for what's actually good for the long-term economic performance of the country. And thereby, by implication, they're also assigned independently of what's good for the debt-bearing capacity of a country in the long term. In a broader context, we find that our results also insert a small piece of the puzzle on whether market constraints are real. So we talked to the golden straitjacket debate insofar as we find a very specific, very influential set of market actors that do impose penalties and rewards on governments' policies and political choices. But as Alison was saying in her discussion of the regression results, these penalties do not seem to also be reciprocated among investors. In the broader theoretical scheme of things, our results shine light on the importance of micro foundations when thinking about financial market behavior. And in this sense, we are walking in the footsteps of scholars like Lena Mosley and Mark Flandreau, both of whom emphasize that in order to understand financial markets at large, we also have to figure out how these financial market actors are making money and what their business models are. And in our case, this has been borne out by our results, because the way we can understand the approach of credit ratings to politics and policy is by understanding their decision-making process and the operational model that allows them to optimize their product for the purpose that it's used for. By implication, this finding also speaks to the evergreen debate in political economy about the relative role of ideas and interests in determining a major political economic outcome. And obviously, we come down on the side of interests in this book by showing how business motivations kind of keep ideas in check, even in a context where experts are expressing opinions. What we find is business motivations are going to dominate their epistemic commitments. Thank you very much for your attention, and we are both looking forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you very much for this. Great talk, great project. And we have a few people in the room with us virtually, as you know. I actually know who all of them are because I've just looked at the participants list. So I'll be calling on you shortly. And as for anyone who's watching on YouTube Live, please put any questions you have into the chat function on YouTube. And we've got someone watching that, and then we can put that into our Q&A and we can ask that straight to the panelists. So I think that Jeff Colgan is actually still here, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, he is. So why not come off mute, Jeff, and see if you can actually ask this question rather than me reading it out. You still there, Jeff? Possibly not, in which case I will ask his question.
Fascinating. I have to let Jeff come in and speak.
Oh, okay. Can you do that?
I need to do that.
Can you do that? I mean, we might as well bring everyone in. It's not as if we're inundated. Just like allow access to everyone who's on the participants list. Can Jeff talk yet?
Hey, can you hear me?
Yay, there we go. That's brilliant. All right. So, I mean, yeah, we seem to be suffering Zoom fatigue. Apparently, this is a thing everywhere whereby everyone's back and we're back on Zoom and everyone's like, oh, I'll give it a miss. So we don't have that many people in the room today. So, Jeff, please go live.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the talk. It's fascinating. And it made me think about credit ratings in a way I hadn't before. So I learned a lot. I'm wondering if I can take your story sort of out from its confines and ask you what, if anything, would be different about your story if you were studying the credit ratings of petrostates. So in addition to market panics, petrostates also face oil price shocks, which seem like a very different kind of financial shock. And so I just wonder whether, understanding fully that this is not the main subject of your study, but can you imagine sort of thinking about credit ratings for them? Are they different from the European developed countries that you focused on?
Yeah, so actually there is a very clear explanation or answer to this in the sovereign credit rating methodologies themselves, because the credit rating methodologies place a really strong focus on all sorts of exposures to sudden changes. And so being dependent on a single commodity is one of the things that methodologies actually explicitly list as one of the risk factors that is going to decrease countries' ratings. So we are not making the argument that it's only that the exposure to shocks is only going to be measured in terms of political and policy factors. There is a whole list of vulnerabilities that rating agencies pay attention to. But what we are saying is that those vulnerabilities can be they are more in the realm of known unknowns, right? So if a country is very much dependent on oil production, then these rating agencies can factor it in explicitly as a factor of or a function of changing oil prices. What is interesting about the political and policy aspects is that those are really trying to ensure against the unknown unknowns, in the sense that once all of the vulnerabilities have been accounted for, countries are still vulnerable to just random stuff happening. So just to answer your question, absolutely. So I would expect that being stuck in commodities or being particularly dependent on a commodity like oil is going to necessarily decrease the credit rating of a country.
But I might also add to this. I think this is a conditional question that is dependent upon kind of politics and policy management that kind of aligns with our argument. And it might not necessarily be so much your dependence on a commodity, but your effective management of that commodity. And do you have mechanisms in place that will protect you from oil shocks and that allows you to save for a rainy day? Because the quintessential petro state in our sample is really Norway, right? And Norway has a AAA credit rating, and it's just generated persistent fiscal surpluses, but it's also managed its North Sea oil wealth very effectively. And so because of that track record of demonstrating that it can competently manage this resource, it has this kind of AAA privilege, where I would imagine other petrostates that have not demonstrated this, that don't have kind of the governance institutions behind wealth generated from a commodity, if they can't demonstrate this, that they can maintain that stability throughout the business cycle, I would imagine that those countries would suffer from lower ratings as a result of commodity dependence.
So really quick follow-up, just to say, so I like both of those answers, and Allison's point in particular, But it strikes me that there may also be a real geopolitical side to this, where it would be interesting, for instance, to see how Venezuela's ratings changed as it moved from friend of the United States to not so much friend of the United States. And of course, that was conflated with a whole lot of other changes, but these kinds of things may have an actual alignment side to it as well. I'll stop now. Thanks so much. A great talk.
So two other people on the call, Barbara Sollings and Jan Stockbroker, are basically pushing in the same way, which is, let's get away from the developed world and commodity producers in this case. Let's think about doing this across the whole world. To what extent do developed country bonds matter more, right? In the sense that if you're worried about, portfolio allocation going awry and basically you're going to blow the credibility in your ratings, does it matter more that you get Sweden right than Argentina?
I think this question has two components, right? So on the one hand, the one component is whether this would work the same way in less prosperous developing countries, and to that the answer is absolutely. And so I think that's the less surprising issue, because that's what everybody would have assumed, especially after Lena Mosley's book, which puts countries into these two categories: the ones with room to move and the others that actually really are treated the way that we all expected global markets to treat countries that are totally dependent on foreign capital. And so in that sense, yes, this works even more for developing countries. But the other side of, or as far as I understood, the other part of your question is whether it matters more to get Sweden's ratings right than Argentina's. And yes, it does matter because so basically the point is that there has to be, so the farther up a country is, the more embarrassing the rating failure is going to be, right? Mm-hmm. And so especially in countries that, to answer this question, I actually have to go a little bit into what ratings do for the financial markets, which is basically they provide some sort of a guarantee that in the case of institutional investors, there is a way for us to measure risk. And so institutional investors use ratings to cover their backs towards their clients who want to make sure that they are not being taken advantage of, and then institutional investors are not taking undue risk on their behalf. But on the other hand, clients also want to be able to prescribe the rules for risk taking. And so in this context, obviously, the more you go down on the rating scale, the more you prove yourself willing to actually put up with risk. So if ratings are off there by a couple of notches, that's going to be a much less embarrassing thing. But if ratings fail to actually show that the highest notches are also not immune to risk, then that undermines the entire authority of ratings, right? And so not only do these countries fall more, but it also is a bigger shock to ratings as an institution overall. And the other thing that I also wanted to point out is that when we talk about countries, it always seems like we are making an elephant out of a mouse, because sovereign ratings themselves and sovereign bonds are not necessarily such a huge part of the rating market. But what really matters for these, the reason why these sovereign ratings are so important is because they also serve as a ceiling for all the other instruments in that country. So basically, when you get Sweden's ratings wrong, you get all the Swedish corporate bonds and all the Swedish banking wrong. And so if you have a rating failure in this investment grade range, that is much more fatal to the whole structure and the whole infrastructure of how we actually measure risk and how we agree on how risky these instruments are.
Alison, do you want to come in?
No, just basically echoing Zsófi. countries that are near that cliff edge, investment versus speculative grade, it's probably not a huge shock if a rating agency decides to downgrade it by 1 or 2 notches. But it's really countries that are in or near that AAA where you can't get it wrong, right? These are countries that shouldn't be defaulting. And so if you have to make a big adjustment, then you've really screwed up in terms of your assessment of the sovereign risk of that country. So I think it's an even bigger indicator of the competencies of rating agencies than countries that are kind of teetering in that investment speculative grade range.
Right. And I think this is fascinating because it really does change the focus of a lot of what we think about with bond markets. So let's take Argentina as the sort of the poster child of all this stuff. Well, they've been teetering on the brink again for the 10th time. They're in negotiations with the IMF, which is on because the IMF own them at this point. And basically, if you look at spreads, bond markets don't care. They've kind of written them off. It's just like an irrelevance, right? They're junk and they'll stay junk, right? That's basically how the market looks at it from that point of view. But what to me is a fascinating point in your argument is the portfolio reallocation part. There's only so much AAA stuff out there. The more that you put into your portfolio, the safer it is, but the lower your yields. Once things stop being AAA and become single A, you need to dump them in many cases, particularly for pension funds and other things. And then that triggers the very thing that the rating agencies have to react to. So it's not as if it's, in the book you describe it more as kind of they're proofing themselves against exogenous shocks. But what I'm suggesting is it's almost like they're proofing themselves against this kind of endogenous shock. That there are these portfolio allocations rules out there, and if a AAA drops, all of that creates problems for them that they have to get ahead of. Is that a fair representation?
Yes, I think what we had more time to go into in the book is that the irony or the tragedy of this, and this is what I was trying to also allude to in the conclusion to our talk, is that these penalties have nothing to do with good policy or good sustainable economic performance or anything like that. But these actually have to do something with the inbuilt instability of the markets, of which rating agencies are actually a crucial part, right? Because what rating agencies need to decide when something bad happens is whether they can actually afford to not downgrade the country and thereby avoiding triggering this shock, which basically, so it cascades through it's a self-reinforcing spiral which cascades through markets, because basically if there is the first indication that a country might be downgraded, then that automatically triggers a sell-off, because those bonds are going to fall out of a given part of the portfolio that has to be AAA or has to be AA plus or whatever. And so because of that sell-off, therefore that triggers a market shock, and that acts back on the ratings, because if that market shock or market reaction is big enough, then that is going to bring into doubt the country's ability to borrow in the short term and having liquidity problems. And of course, then to that, rating agencies respond with further downgrades, and then that triggers another sell-off and so on. And it's actually a very common misconception that this only happens on the border between investment grade and non-investment grade, but portfolio mandates, especially private portfolio mandates, are much more granular than that. So even just a one-notch change can trigger a spiral like that. And so yes, absolutely. What we try to emphasize in the book is that this insurance is necessary for this inbuilt mechanism of which rating agencies are completely embroiled in.
Yeah, I want to go on to a question from Barbara in a moment, but perhaps a nice way of thinking about this is a kind of insurance paradox. So if I'm a fund manager, my insurance move is to make sure that my portfolio is safe through reallocation. So I have fixed reallocation rules. That creates insurance risk for the people who are doing the ratings, who then have to have their defensive move against those things. So it's kind of like this Stapelberger warfare that's going on between these two institutions. And that dynamic really has nothing to do with the economic condition of the country whatsoever. That's really fascinating. Barbara asks, it'd be interesting if you could talk about your interviews. What do the rating agencies think of their model? And how do they think about their model? Tell us about that.
So this really brings in the danger that I will never be able to finish my answer because I was so fascinated by these interviews. So I think that it's what the interviews really bring out is that how don't want to say virtuous they feel, but they actually literally want to explain that this is how this business works. This is why the product is worthy of use by all of these investors, because we are insuring against all of these risks. So the rating analysts say, this is exactly the best we can do for our customers. And the customers are not actually the people who pay for the ratings, because ratings are paid for by the issuers. But when rating analysts talk about their customers, they always mean these big institutional investors. And so they basically say, we have a completely clear conscience because what we are doing is exactly what we are supposed to do. We are supposed to make investors conscious of all the downsides, all the downside risks that they can possibly come across. And so they would say things like, I'm looking for one quote, which says, there has to be a strategy in place for a large jump, like from AAA to A. A smoother path has to be in place if that sort of transition is even possible. Therefore, whatever can happen within your rating horizon needs to be incorporated in the rating. And the rating horizon depends on where you are on the rating scale. The higher up, the longer it needs to be, because there has to be a credible path in mind that will take you from a very high rating, possibly into non-investment grade. So they explicitly say that this is their guarantee to their customers, that they have taken everything into consideration. And this actually also answers Mark's question from before, that the higher up you are, the more insurance there is going to be for these kinds of factors. And the other thing that I wanted to say with respect to this is that the interviews also highlighted that rating agencies are actually not that secretive about this stuff. They actually want to talk about it because they want to reassure their customers by saying, we have built in everything that you can possibly think of, right? So yes, I should stop talking about the interviews because I could go on and on.
No, but I mean, I think that, kind of the point of transparency is really crucial. And it's really why this book is possible. We like to think about market actors behind smoke screens and, making decisions behind closed doors. But the one thing that credit rating agencies do relative to other market actors is they release a lot of information on what they do. They always justify what they do with country reports, and anytime they make a decision, they explain precisely why. And so this provides a lot of great empirical material to try and understand how these actors tick.
But under your reading of that, isn't it necessary to conclude that most of that is smokescreen? Because they're not actually going to come out and say, look, at the end of the day, we really don't give a damn what they're doing or how they're doing it. We just care about the fact that we don't want to be caught by a downgrade surprise because that's bad for our business model. Here's some fluff that we're going to say about Italy, right? I mean, doesn't it kind of, don't if we take your argument seriously, don't we have to discount those reports more?
Well, those reports are saying exactly, what I think is the most important thing is that they always have to point out the downside risks, right? So yes, in a sense, it's fluff, but they are going to say, trust us, if there is anything wrong that could happen, we are going to act on it.
Right,
and we are going to call your attention to it. And I think this, again, goes back to this idea. And I think it's important that many people think that ratings are used by actual investors in terms of making their decision. And therefore, they would say, why would an investor want to have such a negatively approached, why would they take such a negative approach that doesn't take into consideration that things can actually go well? But that's not the case. What ratings are used for is this relationship between institutional investors and their clients. And for that relationship, unearthing all the possible downside risk is the best thing that the rating agencies can do. And so if they talk about all of these political problems in the case of Italy, that's to show the users of the ratings that they have really thought about everything that can go wrong, and then of course they have to be rather pessimistic about it.
Go ahead, Alison.
And I would say in regards to that, in terms of how we talk about policy or how they talk about policy and window dressing, et cetera, it really, I think at the end of the day, in line with our argument, it really depends on whether credit rating agencies believe that a government can get its act together in the face of a shock and correct its fiscal balances. And I think, looking at this kind of fluff that's discussed, so to speak, it's really interesting to see how it's treated in a country like Germany versus a country like Italy. So in Germany's always getting chastised about its inflexible labor markets, about its generous pension system, et cetera. But Shofi had a great interview with an analyst that said, these are discussions that are going on in the wider debate about what labor market should look like in the 2000s, but we're not actually going to downgrade Germany from AAA if it doesn't reform its labor market. Whereas with Italy, when the five-star Liga coalition government came out and released its budget, I mean, the credit rating agencies actually downgraded Italy because in that budget, they were going to essentially reverse important pension reforms. So Germany has the capacity to get away with a much more generous system than Italy. And when Italy made those changes, when it threatened those changes, credit rating agencies did materially respond. And now, I mean, Italy is just basically teetering on speculative grade status right now, just kind of coming through the COVID shock. So, this does have really drastic material implications, even for developed countries.
This is something that we'll get into in the podcast, and I'm just flagging that for everybody that there will be a podcast and we'll continue the conversation. But in an era in which basically Italian government bond is effectively insured by the central bank, is there really that much risk? Does that change the game? Hold that thought. Barbara's got one more, and it fits into one that Darryl has sent us in from YouTube. So I'm going to read the two of them together because they go together, and that'll be our last question. Are there any important differences amongst the three agencies, or are they almost in lockstep? And Darryl asks, are these agencies, and I'm going to insert the word still themselves too big to fail? Given how much they create their own gravity, what scenario could create any meaningful space for competition, given your way of thinking about the business model? Is it a lock, and do they move in lockstep?
So the statistical analysis shows that there is 1 or 2 notches difference on average between these guys. So sometimes, yes, they try to differentiate themselves very marginally, but in general, they do move in lockstep. And I have to say that just reading the things that they're reading their reports, they do have slightly different stylistic elements. So Standard & Poor's is going to sound, in the reports of Standard & Poor's sound a lot more like a bully pulpit, whereas Fitch is going to be a bit more restrained in its tone. But at the end of the day, they really talk about the same things. And if you talk to the analysts, they have very similar ideas and very similar ways of talking about this. In terms of whether a credit rating agency could even be ejected from this position, it's really interesting because the big three seem to be cemented forever. And I think in the case of sovereign ratings, there hasn't been enough difference in their performance to have one be killed by the other two. Well, one interesting thing is that you could ask, is there anything they could do that would, lock them out of this lucrative market? And it doesn't seem like in sovereign ratings there has been a case. But if you look at Standard & Poor's market share of the structured finance products after the big debacle of the global crisis, what you find that from that market, they really have been ejected, not just by the other two, but actually by new entrants, because basically what happened there is that they used to have more than 50% of the market, if I remember correctly, and they lost 2/3 of the market share after they have been shown to really have gone wrong in terms of rating those structured market products. So in principle, it is possible for these guys to get ejected from this cushy position. It takes a really, really big mistake, and it takes a really big mistake that other rating agencies are not simultaneously making to prove a credit rating agency wrong enough to be ejected from such a good position.
Exactly. All right. So with that in mind, Darrell, I hope that answered your question. They're probably still too big to fail, but they can lose market share. We're at time. Thank everyone who's watching on YouTube, everyone who's inside us in the room here at Brown, and thank to both of you for this excellent conversation. I look forward to regrouping and recording the podcast version and then tweeting that out. Until soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.